Hello, hello. Hi, everybody. Great to see you guys. Welcome, welcome. I'm going to move this AI. I'll just give another minute for some more folks to join. Hope everybody's doing well this morning. I had a very interesting day yesterday. I live in Hawaii. I don't know if you saw, we had a tsunami warning, so that was fun. Put all the cats in boxes and threw them in the car and went up the hill. It's pretty interesting. So feeling grateful for safety today, and prayers for all those who aren't experiencing that in this moment. Let's take a moment just to ground ourselves in before we dive in. I'll introduce myself and we can get off and running as people join. So go ahead and close down your eyes and just feel your feet on the floor. Can everyone hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up. I want to make sure. Cool. Great. Yeah, close down your eyes, feeling your feet on the floor, feeling yourself in your seat, and just letting your nervous system settle for a moment. Feeling as if there's roots growing out of your feet into the earth, through whatever floor is beneath you. Remembering that connection to the soil, all the bacteria and the mycelium, the earth that makes our bodies. Just letting yourself ground in, feeling anything that's been stirring you up, just let it settle like dust settling in a pond. Letting the water clear, feeling your vessel become fully present. And from that space of presence, gratitude for being able to show up in these incredible spaces that stretch across time and physical space. We'll take 3 deep breaths. So first breath into your belly. Feel your shoulders expand and release. And with each breath, feel a little bit of a drop in your shoulders and your neck. Move second breath in, deep into the belly, and release with a little more tension going out. Last breath in, feeling your roots really deepen into the earth, into your belly. And let that release. As you stretch your shoulders, letting yourself come back into presence in this room. Just remembering that we can do that anytime, all the time, whenever we need. What yesterday reminded me is how much we need to really practice the grounding, because life is in this moment, these times, going to keep slinging us stuff to try to throw us off. So may we find that those moments to take a pause and ground in and remember that we're here and we're present in this moment. We are safe. So my name's Aubrey. I wasn't on the last open call. I just want to introduce myself really quick. Actually, I'll change my name here so you can see it. I have been with Culture Hack for the last 4 years, running the Rhizome Fellowship. And yeah, just really excited to see folks who are excited to learn this work. I'm a futurist by training, got my doctorate in alternative futures and indigenous politics, and then ran a leadership fellowship here in Hawaii for about 7 years, teaching about systems change and systems for social impact. And that led into the narrative-led systems change work and all that we're doing here. So happy to be with you all. I'm going to share my screen now and just let people in as they arrive. I wonder if there's a way really quick to just let people in no matter what. Well, I think we'll figure it out. Okay. So let me share. Hold on 1 second. Hold on, I just lost my screen with the. So we're basically going to share about the listening, and apologies that the update email went out a little late, but hopefully folks had a chance to watch some of that stuff. And then we'll have time for questions. So let me just pull up that presentation. We're in listening now, which is the second phase. Hopefully folks were able to work a little bit on your point of view, and we can talk about that at the end. This is the part that gets into more of the data analysis and starting to understand what's actually happening out there in the world. Okay, here we go. And share my screen. All right. These guys. Okay. All right. All right, here we go. So we're here in open session 2, listening model and narrative communities. And we'll talk about what that means, but this is really, if you remember the flow or the arc of how the methodology works. First, we're asking, who is it that's in this inquiry? Who are we? You know, the capital W, we, that's doing this work. And now we're actually opening our aperture. And in systems thinking, what we want to do in this phase is really like we're actively listening without expectation of what we're going to hear. I feel like that's a really big grounding piece of this, because we often feel like we're going with these preconceived notions of what's happening in our narrative space. And what we're trying to do in this part is just open up and be receiving whatever is actually out there, because it may change what we perceive and what we believe about our narrative space. So that's a really important grounding piece. So we're here on July 30th. And we're doing the listen phase. On August 27th, we'll go into understanding. So again, just opening aperture in this phase to not yet have any judgment, just really to receive what is out there, not what we wish to be, but what is. And then we'll go into understanding it, then recoding it from that space, and then actually developing a hack. So the resources available to you all is the curriculum. We've got the recordings that we're sharing out, these open calls, and then the AI tools will be able to help you. We're developing these AI agents, you know, definitely a fraught understanding of AI and what it's doing in the world, and yet it's here. And so we're looking at ways to work with it, you know, more as kin, and thinking about how we might, you know, develop ways to work with AI agents in service to this work. So we've been doing some really interesting experiments there that we'll share out with you guys as well. These are some of the videos that we'll have available to you. We'll share out this presentation when we're done, but we've got, you know, the website, this YouTube videos I'll share in just a minute, in the different self-learning pathways. And these are all these links will be available to you as well. So today we'll talk about the point of view again, just to review that, which is what was discussed last time. We'll share the listening model, and we'll talk about a case study called the Territories of Transition, where we worked with a group of land defenders, Indigenous land defenders, around this idea of land back. And the hack that emerged from that was land back to right relations. So we'll share how we got to that and sort of what that pathway looked like, and then some next steps. I'm just going to check here really quick if there's anyone in the waiting room. Okay. So in last session, we talked about point of view. Who are you? Or like the caterpillar in Alice in Wonderland. Who are you? Who is this we? Who's showing up to the table? Who is this collective? Because it may be just your organization. It might be your organization plus others. It might be more of a community-based narrative intervention. So really getting a sense of like, what are the boundary lines around this big capital W we, right? What is the motivation? Like, why are we doing this? What is the desired outcome? And how will your hack create the change that you seek? So it's really just a grounding piece of like, who's here? What are we doing? Why are we doing it? So we understand what we're trying to listen for. And in many ways, this becomes like the boundary defining space for what you're going to listen for. So sometimes you'll get into the listening process and you realize, wow, our point of view needs to be iterated. So it's a living document. It's not meant to be static. So you can go back and be like, actually, it's changed, or we brought in new partners, or who we are is shifted, and we actually need to bring these people in that we didn't think were going to be involved. So all of that is up for for shifting and changing and being in evolution. And the recording will be linked here in the presentation. So from point of view to listening to the narrative. So we're opening up our aperture, we're starting to do our listening. And I'm going to share this first video on the why we have listening objectives. You just relax back and have a listen. Volume good? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so exciting to be already on our second step in the narrative change journey. And what we'll do in this session is guide you from transforming your point of view into a listening model. So if you go to the next slide, here again, you can see this bird's eye view of the Culture Hack Labs method.
We've lost the sound.
I think we lost the sound.
You know what? Sorry, I think because I muted myself. Let's start that again. Hold on. Restart it right here.
Slide.
Is that good?
Here again, you can see this bird's eye view of the Culture Hack Labs method. So in Ask, we've written our point of view, and now we're in Listening, in which we design our listening model. And essentially the outcome of this step is enabling us to identify narrative communities. So this is a list of narrative communities in the narrative space and a reminder what narrative communities are, although we'll dive much deeper into this in 2 weeks. They are a group of people talking to each other about a specific topic. And if we move on to the next slide, as I said, we listen to identify narrative communities. So what I'll do now is set you up a bit about what the listening model is, what the process of listening is, and then Fede will go deeper into the 2 types of listening that we will explore, big and small listening. So again, on the next slide, we have here an example point of view from the Territories of Transition project, or the Land Back to Right Relations project that Andrea introduced at the beginning. And we want to essentially outline here that defining your listening model must be guided by why you want to listen, as outlined in your point of view. So in this little snapshot of the TOT point of view, it says, we're going straight forward to there. Therefore, we want to question the separation between human and nature, which puts the land as a resource and as commodities that can be sold and owned. So what we want you to do here is then imagine that you have a big ear that can listen to many people's conversations about this specific topic. So in this case, on land, or the relationship between human and nature. And we want you to think about what are you most interested in listening to, and what your listening model will do is codify the different activities you will have to engage in order to answer these questions. So in this slide, again, you can see this big ear listening to the narrative space, and the listening model is essentially another term for narrative research. So it really sets the parameters for the data collection and the data analysis process. And here you can see the big ear listening to different narratives in the narrative space or the public discourse around land. So land is property, people are saying land is money. There are some narratives that are saying land is sacred or land is kin. And again, before Fede gives you some more specific information about how to really design the specifics of your listening model, we will think about some critical background questions. In the next slide. So first, thinking about beyond the echo chamber. Often our struggles might not appear in the mainstream conversation, and we must interrogate why. And many organizations or narrative research projects are not quite listening outside of these echo chambers. They're kind of preaching to the choir, listening to the choir. And we want to really interrogate where are the conversations happening? Where can we effectively listen? And what are the inherent limitations of these spaces? For example, in the structure of listening online, it has its own limitations, and there are many power dynamics that come when you're listening. For example, in the more qualitative, small listening, we must think about how our presence contributes to power dynamics and maybe distorts what we are listening to. And then on the next slide, we're still thinking about this why of our narrative-led systems change project. And so we want to start thinking about our listening objectives. So yeah, your listening objectives are really transforming your point of view into the why. While the point of view is the perspective from where we're listening, the why is then the inquiry we want to answer. So if we go back to the territories of transition example, the why is in order to question the separation between human and nature. I want to understand how, say, youth in my community think about land ownership. And now I'll pass to Fede to go more into the big and small listening that we want you to explore.
Thank you, Tiffany. So again, what is listening, right? Like the specific action of going out there and try to understand better the theme and the narrative that we are working with. And there are different scales of listening. We could listen to the local conversation, like the connected issues and the themes in our communities, right? How is youth talking about land ownership? How is youth talking about climate emergency? We could go into the media, right? How is the mainstream or the independent media covering this issue? How is the big media covering climate emergency? But also how is independent media covering that same topic? Are there differences? So that is a small listening, something that we can do manually, right? But then we could also use other spaces for listening. So let's say, for example, social media, how people talks about the topic on internet platforms, right? Which again, as Tiffany said, there will be limitations. Maybe a lot of people from the global majority won't be in those social medias, right? Maybe only people who have internet access will be actually talking in those platforms. So understanding those boundaries and those limitations is important when we set the scale of the listening. And again, we could try to listen to the very local, but we could also try to listen to the region, right? How is the region or the bioregion conversating about the specific narrative we are interested in, right? Again, when catastrophe happen, right? How is people talking about climate emergency in the region, right? Maybe there are some specific patterns that we can find in the big listening. And just to break it into specifics, right? What we say when we talk about listening model is actually putting together those two different ways of listening, right? The small, which is something that we can process humanly, right? Which allows us to identify the nuances and the texture in the narratives, right? How people talks in their local assembly about the specific topic we are working with, right? That is something that the internet won't allow us to actually listen to, right? But for example, in the big listening, some things that are very specific to the local conversation or to the small listening, we might not be able to see it from this broader perspective, right? So the big listening identifies the broader patterns in the narrative. It helps us understand the big picture of a conversation, right? Why my community is not present in this bigger regional conversation, right? Is it because only a few actors have access to big media, for example, or to social media? Or why, like a very specific, like narrative communities talking about it, but others are not, right? So the big listening also allows us to see these differentiated patterns. And what we have in the center when we make the small listening and the big listening is our big listening model, which is guided by the why. Why do we want to listen to the narratives, right? So just to go a little bit more specific again to how do we set the small listening, we will have our big why, right? I want to listen how indigenous youth talk about land ownership. Okay, that is my why. But then now I need to be very specific, right? Is what are the themes that I am interested in? Who are the demographics I am interested to listen to? When, right? When is that conversation important for me? So, for example, right, the conversation about migration or displacement will be very different prior to, you know, like the uprisings that just happened in California, right? So if we said, okay, I want to very specifically listen to the narrative during the uprisings, is going to be very different from another moment in time. So the when is very specific, very important and very specific, and also the where. So it's going to be very different, the talk about displacement and migration in California during the uprisings than it will be in the south of the Americas or in Abya Yala, you know, like at the same time, in the same moment. So the geography and the platforms are important. It's not going to be the same if we listen to Twitter than if we listen to the big media, for example, right? And finally, the how is the method that we are using to listen, right? So are we just going into the assembly and take notes of the assembly? Are we going into the assembly and then maybe record and then transcribe that conversation? Are we, you know, like making specific interviews to specific people, right? Through polls or through direct engagement, right? So the how is going to be very important because the how will give you very specific, you know, like data sets or information that you will have then to process later. So when we do the small listening, we want to go through these questions, right? What am I going to listen, who, when, where, and how? And for the big listening, it's the same thing. But then in the big listening, we will be using different tools that might be useful for us, right? So some of your organization might already have access to some of these big listening tools, like, for example, social media monitoring or big news monitoring or AI-guided social media monitoring, right? Like there might be different tools, but the important thing is that we need to have those specific questions very clearly aligned, right? If I want to listen to the youth and how it's talking about land ownership, I need to choose very wisely the platform. I need to choose very wisely the when and the how. So it is important that we start to use this muscle of the listening, and we start to also be very, you know, like focused into what we want to achieve, right? So how a listening model looks like, right? This is just an example, right? Maybe in week 1, I will go closer to our communities through online polls. In week 2, I will make a national media monitoring daily, and then I will do that monitoring during the rest of the fellowship. And then maybe in week 3, I will start trying to listen to the social media in my specific platforms, right? And in week 4, I will try to make a research in a more regional narrative with specific broader tools. And then in week 5, I will have a local encounter or forum or assembly where I want to listen to the community that I am interested in listening, right? So how is it going to look for your project? That is actually what we want you to start thinking in the next couple of weeks. How do you go from your point of view into a specific plan for listening to your narrative?
Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay, so that was about listening in sort of the broad sense, big listening and small listening. Now we're going to have a video about narrative communities. So basically, once you start doing your listening, you're starting to notice patterns. So as you're doing the listening and as you're collecting the data, sort of spread your awareness out to start to see what patterns are emerging in the listening. And what you're going to do with that information is to start to form what we call narrative communities. And this is kind of a fun, like, artistic moment where you can give them really fun names and things that sort of speak to what that narrative is talking about. But that will become important to have these communities and these patterns start to show up, because we will map them next in the understand phase. So where we're going with this is the ability to see the narratives as sort of patterns in the broader narrative system. And then we're going to map them so that we understand where it's most effective to intervene when we eventually do our hack. So again, you're sort of paying attention to patterns, you're collecting data with a really open ear, non-judging awareness of what is in the system, so that you can then start to digest and work with that information. Okay, I'll play this video.
So now we're going to jump ahead a little bit to look at what the output or the outcomes of the listening model and the data collection and the data analysis process is, which is finding narrative communities. So narrative communities are really the crux of the Culture Hack Lab's methodology. And if you move to the next slide, we have here the listening cycle. So this kind of just trying to situate you in where we are. It's a bit complex, but I'm just going to simply go through it. So obviously you've designed your POV, your point of view, you've transformed that into the listening model. The outcome here will be the narrative communities after data collection. And what we'll do is we'll list the narrative communities that we find in this specific narrative space that you're exploring, or whatever you want to call it, the public conversation, the public discourse. And then what we'll do is map the narrative communities to really understand where they are and their potential in shifting the whole narrative space to where we want it to go. Then we will decide where we want to intervene in this map. So we will do the reframe and recode process. Then we will do the hack. So we'll kind of seed these reframes in these interventions. And based on impact metrics, which we'll go through in the next weeks, we'll continually reassess these change hypotheses that we'll come up with in the next weeks. This will all become more clear. But the main thing here to take away is that this is all an iterative process that can last during your whole hack. And yeah, we will learn more about your narrative and who participates on it as you go through your listening cycles. So back to narrative communities. You've probably heard us talk about them a lot, but here we really will go into them a little bit more. Narrative communities are groups of people or nodes or actors talking to each other about a specific topic in a similar way. And they might not know each other personally, but they're part of this same echo chamber. On to the next slide. So this is all a little bit of kind of context and giving you some tips as you start doing your listening to help you best find narrative communities at the end of the process. So a top tip before you list the narrative communities is to think about what kinds of communities we're looking for. So we always advise we're looking for different kind of broad categories of conversation or discourse or narrative communities. One is the dominant discourses, and the others are alternative or catalytic discourses or communities that we'll go into. And what I'm going to do is go through these different types of communities and see this more as a helpful framework or tool to help you find communities and help you really listen to your own data. So when we talk about criteria for selection here, we're going to design this together. We will help you along the process, but it's essentially outlining how we go from all of this data, all of these conversations or surveys or interview insights you get to listing the narrative communities. So hopefully it's useful. So first, we outline dominant discourses. So these dominant discourse communities or conversations, these are people or actors or organizations or publications or like general nodes that reproduce the narratives and worldviews that uphold the status quo. So they're really reinforcing the systems and perspectives that we're trying to transform. They maintain the existing power structures or conventional wisdom or established institutional narratives. And these might include discourse coming from politicians or businessmen, corporate actors, or other representatives of the violences that we see in the narrative space. And they have access to the media and probably have their own channels to spread the message. And they can be part of our movements too, those who are connected to or perpetuating these extractive interactions. And then we move on to alternative and catalytic communities. So these are non-dominant discourses, and I'm going to explain these two separately because they're slightly different. There's nuance between them. So alternative communities, these are people or actors or publications, etc., that challenge the dominant view or the hegemonic discourse in the academic jargon. They open up the space for new perspectives, ones that can really shift culture in the direction we want it to go. And these communities propose transformative narratives and create openings for this narrative-led systems change. And they might be the ones closest to our resistance and organizing and grassroots collective groups. We can summon them to be part of our culture hack. We want them to actively participate, not just replicate our messages. But we also mentioned beware of the echo chamber. They might be your allies, but they're not necessarily your audiences here. Then we move on to catalytic communities. So again, this is an example of non-dominant discourse. And these are, it may be a subsection of alternative communities or discourse, you could say. These are actors, nodes, or people that have the potential to trigger or accelerate the transformation or the evolution in the broader narrative space or public conversation. They kind of act as bridges or enablers for systems change. And I will, at this point, we will introduce a little example to bring the idea of catalytic and alternative and dominant communities to life. And then we will go through a little bit more about narrative communities. So right now I'll pass to Melandri, who will introduce the research we're going to present right now. And I'm also going to put the link in the chat because we're going to be very, it's going to be a very, very light insight. And if you're interested in this research, you can explore it yourself.
Hi, everyone. So this particular case study was our project that we conducted in collaboration with the Transition Resource Circle. We co-created a point of view with the TRC, which highlighted the positionality of those involved with the project. This is a shortened version of it. So it states, we are narrative practitioners and philanthropic actors embedded within capitalist modernity who recognize our complicity in perpetuating dominant systems. We see that philanthropy represents the most symbolic paradox of capitalism, using wealth accumulated through extractive systems to solve the very problems that wealth accumulation creates. Therefore, We want to transform philanthropy from a structure rooted in control and extraction toward one that serves as liberation and regeneration. So our listening objective for this, while why, was to map the current narrative landscape within philanthropy to identify strategic intervention points that can advance post-capitalist philanthropy. Our small listening for this project mainly consisted of interviews with partners and allies, as well as using the Post-Capitalist Philanthropy book, which had some vital insights into the philanthropic space and actors. We then conducted big listening using a social listening platform, and we provided to provide an overview of the landscape. And this was done by searching for particular keywords that we identified, such as decolonization, just transition, and philanthropy, looking into social media spaces as well as media outlets for this. So Tiffany will be taking us through the narrative communities for this particular work.
Brilliant. Thanks, Melandri. And again, we're just giving you a taste of where you'll arrive at after your listening process. So here you can see communities A to F, just briefly the business as usual community. It's the dominant one, evidently, because these are narratives that kind of propel neoliberal paradigms, and they profess they're fixing symptoms. They're not looking at causes. These are more cosmetic fixes. And it's very much the dominant narrative in philanthropy, which upholds the status quo. And then we have B, the systems change community, which does move from addressing symptoms to addressing root causes, yet they're not conscious of their complicity in the system. So I would actually say they are alternative, but they have the risk of kind of lapsing into this dominant narrative category. Then we have the alternative narrative communities C and D, which are decolonization. So this is really looking at redistribution and systems change, as well as this recognition of philanthropy's complicity in maintaining these neoliberal systems. So this is very much an alternative discourse community. And reparations community D is kind of an offshoot of decolonization, also an alternative discourse. And here they're looking at philanthropy as reparation. And then we move to E and F. And these communities are very much the catalytic communities in the narrative space around philanthropy, which was our main topic. And they are catalytic because they can accelerate the evolution of the narrative space towards more life-centric and post-capitalist futures, because they are doing things differently, maybe. So like new custodians are talking about redistribution, but money must be in the hands of the very communities they serve in a more distributed, decentralized way. And the reimagining wealth catalytic community is reimagining wealth beyond its market definition. So this might include non-monetary resources such as connection to earth or access to water or seeds, varieties of seeds or elders' knowledge, etc. So here is a lot of information. You can read more about this research on our website, but it's just giving you a taste, like I said, of where you eventually will get to this list of narrative communities. So now back to Melandri, who will give you a taste of attention network power.
So the attention network and power, or ANP analysis, is our first step in the next module, which you'll be learning about in detail, which is the understand phase. We'll be giving you a first look at it here as to what it is and how we will use it. The first step is in basically engaging with the narrative communities. It will be your way of analyzing and understanding these communities. We use ANP to help us understand the frequency, the strength, and growth of communities that are relevant to our work. We will be delving into each of these core concepts in the next slides. And later in the understand phase, we will also explain how we use ANP to identify the most recurrent language in the community. Next slide, please. So the attention phase, sorry. The attention phase, in simple terms, mainly looks at where and when the conversation is taking place. We often look at the quality and quantity of attention that is driving the specific narrative community. An example of this from the previous case study and report that Tiffany mentioned, Wealth as a Transition Pathway, is the business as usual community. We noted that this community is the oldest one in institutional philanthropy, and it is tied to the logics of philanthropy's inception. This is a large dominant discourse community that is prominent in the global north. Network simply refers to the most influential actors, institutions, platforms, and domains, or the nodes that are most central to this narrative. This is the social network that underlies it. Again, looking at the business as usual community, we see that the network is made up of big philanthropists in the global north, such as Bill Gates and Melinda Gates, Jeff Bezos, Mackenzie Scott, and all of their foundations. Next slide. Finally, we have the power aspect of the analysis, and this mainly refers to the influence, strength, and the centrality of a narrative community in the overall space. We do this by looking at the volume or quantity, and this is often done by looking at social media metrics or the actors or voices most prevalent, as well as the shared messaging or unity, and then the consistency of engagement over time. This is also called commitment. These metrics tell us the community's influence and resilience. Again, with our business as usual community, we noted that the community is generally large, given the number of hits and the prominence of the narratives underlying the community. It is powerful, and in terms of the magnitude of their wealth, their attachment to the global operating system, and the popularity of the solutions proposed by actors in the community. So as you can see from this slide, this is basically just the kind of template that we will be looking at when it comes to identifying and categorizing your own narrative communities. After the A&P analysis, our next step will be to identify the logics and frames that are prominent to them, and we will be speaking about this in our next session. Tiffany will walk us through the narrative journey steps in the next slide.
Okay, so just wrapping this all up, we thought it would be useful to give you a bit of a sequence of steps. So like I said, please use us. We're your advisors and we can ping pong ideas off you and help you in this journey. But basically, you've gone from refining your point of view to creating your listening model. And then what you're going to be doing soon is collecting your data and organizing these raw materials and processing your data using criteria as a guide. So these frameworks such as the catalytic, alternative, and dominant discourses. And some top tips that are useful before you list your narrative communities are actually organizing your data into insights. And these are answering questions such as like, what are the overall trends and patterns I'm seeing in the conversations I'm having, or what's and who is saying what, and what are the most influential voices, and do they interact with each other, and most importantly as well, like what are we not seeing in the data. And so once you've maybe listed some insights and you've become closer to your data, you know it a little bit more, then you can really start identifying a list of narrative communities.
Okay, lots to take in. Just to resituate us, we're here, we've done the ask is our point of view, listen is what we're talking about. There were some questions about narrative communities and attention network power. We're going to dive deeper into attention network power in the understand phase. So really in this phase, you're thinking about listening, opening your ears, doing the data collection, and then just starting to notice the patterns for the communities. I'm going to walk us through one more case study as an example. Someone's asking where can I watch the recordings. We'll share those out on the email list. And if you didn't get that, just ping us on email. We'll make sure you get that. So I'm going to go through, then we'll go into the understand phase, which is the mapping piece, from that, we'll be able to think about how do we, recode this narrative that we're trying to shift. And then from that recoding, what do we want to do in terms of the hack and taking it out into the world as a prototype? Okay, so I'm going to just jam through these slides because it's what we just went through and get to our case study here. So all of this is in the presentation you'll get. So the other case study is the Territories of Transition. This was a group that we brought together in 2023 that was all Indigenous land defenders, frontline folks who are out there really defending the earth and understanding what might they teach each other across territories, where is there resonance, where are there similar things happening, and how might they lift each other's work up and come up with a shared narrative around really rethinking the way we understand the relationship between man and the earth, humans and the earth. So the why was to find shared key frames around the lands and the commons conversation that could be used across communities working towards the same kind of social and ecological justice. We've got a link to that report. It's also on the website. If you go into our issues section, we've got all of these reports and we share out the white papers and all the sources and the research. So it should all be there, but if you have additional questions, just let us know after you look at that stuff. The listening model, we looked at themes, demographics, date range, platforms, geography, and strategy. And so again, these diverse land defenders kind of brought together their different issues they were dealing with, narratives they were confronting, and came up with a shared listening model to see what might emerge as a collective. So in the narrative communities, we were looking for, things like people who share frames around issues like land back, where that's like a kind of a common frame that's being used, how is it being used and where, and understanding which terminology was being used in different territories and where is the crossover and where was their resonance. So we were looking for narrative communities that kind of crossed over territories, that using shared topics and language around the same sort of bigger topic. And the communities that came out, so again, you're looking at patterns that are emerging through the listening and then giving them a name that kind of resonates with what that narrative space is. Someone was asking about the idea of echo chambers, and we're just using that terminology because, as you understand in social media or anything these days, it's like we kind of get in these tracks where everyone's talking about the same thing in the same way, and we're trying to open ourselves up to see like where are there multiple. So it's really important in the listening to challenge yourself to listen to some of the dominant narratives that might really like trigger you and get your ire up, because that's why we're doing this work. But it's important to understand what's being said in spaces that are outside of our kind of echo chamber, right? So when we listened in at the Territories of Transition, these were the people, how they're speaking about the human nature relationship, how they're speaking about property, ownership of property, land back, rematriation of land, these sort of big terms related to our relationship with the earth and with land. These are the communities that emerged. So everything from community land trusts to the land back movement, rights of nature, comunidad, food sovereignty, ecocidio, etc. So these were 7 communities that emerged. There's not really a magic number, but you don't want too many, because too many is going to be hard to map, hard to understand. So you're looking for somewhere, I'd say between 4 to maybe 8 maximum communities that you want to focus on. And yeah, so don't push yourself to have too many. I'd say at least 4, because you're going to want to be able to map them across the spectrum. And you'll see when we get into the mapping phase, you're looking for, stuff that's in the dominant narrative, that's like, what we're trying to shift, all the way to the people that are like way out on the other edge of their activism, that may be just a small community, but could be really important in the narrative shift, and then everything in between. So you're looking for that broad swath. You want to be able to cover all the bases so you understand the full narrative space that you're dealing with. I don't know, I'm trying to think how long this, this is a short video. We'll show this and then we'll have time for some questions. Oh, I guess, sorry, let me go back to that one. I think that video is available. Here we go. Yeah, it's just 2 minutes.
In the era of extermination, where the race for infinite economic growth is leading us to planetary collapse, we call for a reimagining of narratives about our belonging to Earth. Climate crisis, pandemics, forced displacement, mass extinction of species, ecocide, genocide, wars for fossil fuels, dispossession for green energy, fascism dressed as democracy, systems of institutional inequality. The heirs of those who 500 years ago stole the land of our ancestors are today the elites responsible for this environmental, social, economic, and spiritual crisis. Their global system of laws and violence enclosed the land and imposed a logic of property based on extractivism. Culture Hack Labs call for land back to right relations. We call on those who seek to transform the dominant narratives of land ownership. We call on those who are part of diverse and anti-colonial movements, those who seek to decommodify the land and create regenerative models, those who belong to indigenous resistance and defend their territories, those who plant the seeds of ancestral futures. From Milpa America to Alakshak, this is our call to join the territories of transition, a narrative change project to give back to the earth our condition of existence.
So that video is a hack. That's what came, one of the products, if you want to use that terminology, that came out of that experience with the territories of transition. And you'll notice that the frame in there was land back to right relations. So what came through that work and what sort of the collective decided was this notion of land back really had a lot of, we'll talk again about attention, network, and power behind it. It was a really strong frame that was being talked about across a lot of different diverse groups, but that it was missing that piece about right relations. And so that was sort of like a key thing to put back in there was land back to right relations, because just land back wasn't enough, wasn't sufficient. There needed to be that piece around right relations with the land, right relations with each other, to really flesh out that frame. But it was catchy enough and had that really like a lot of attention and power already behind it that we felt that would be much more effective in terms of impact. And again, that's a prototype that will be tested and revisited. And another prototype that came out was that this group is continuing to meet as a council and to continue their work across territories. So there's different ways that hacks can show up, and they're all very experimental and innovative in nature. And you're sort of iterating as you go, seeing how it lands, what rhizomatic things emerge from that, and moving on to keep growing it. So this is their point of view. You can read that when you have some time, and their why. So 2 inquiries that were kind of guiding the listening. This is a bit about their model, how they, sort of went through the listening as a collective. So the different, 5 weeks, and listening can take years, or it can be done in weeks. So it really just depends on your intervention. Sort of, are you trying to get to something like you need to present something at COP? Okay, there's a timeline. Or is this like a big, systems change effort you're working on over the next 10 years? You might have a different, frame of time for your listening model, depending on what you're doing. So just be right-sized about it. And if you're new to the methodology, I always recommend just, taking off a bite-sized chunk that you can actually work with and digest and metabolize. So, don't feel like you have to have a fully robust research base, right out the gates. Do 5 to 10 interviews, small listening, and see what happens and what you learn. And then you can always add to it. So the process can circle back and you can add to your listening and you can expand your listening model. But start with something that's possible for you with where you're at, the capacity you have in your organization or in your independent work. So you can really get the muscles moving for understanding how to listen and how to think about narratives and narrative communities. You guys can read this. I want to open up a little bit of space for some questions. The next steps after this call, what you'll do is kind of thinking about your listening model and working through some of those questions that were in the slides about like the who, where, what, those sorts of things. And then I will stop the share so we can open up for a few minutes of questions. Anyone have anything they want to ask or comments, reflections? Go ahead and raise your hand or just come off mute. It's a lot of information to take in, so sometimes the questions come after. How are we feeling? Jamie.
Hi, Aubrey. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us, and for also grounding us at the beginning of this. I think that's something that I've had so many Zoom meetings today, and I really welcomed it. So thank you for that. I have a question about how you bring in the information and sort it. Is there a mechanism that you especially trust? in how you code it, and or a tool that you think is especially useful?
You know, I'm going to ask our research team about that because they're the ones that deal with the big amounts of data, and we can share out some of their favorite tools.
That'd be
Because
great.
yeah, again, there's like so many, it's
So
social
many.
science research, right? So but for the particular research of narratives, I'll ask our research team to share that out.
Thank you. That would be so great.
Yeah, definitely. Because it can be a lot to hold on to. Yeah, for sure. Other questions? Any reflections? And yeah.
I would like to repeat my question from the chat.
Oh, sure.
So, you said it was a field that you looked at, but how did you define the field with this broad topic of philanthropy? You know, for me, it's humanity. Did you look at humanity, or was there?
No, so that's where the point of view becomes really important, because that's kind of your boundary line. Because otherwise, you know, with any complex system, if you keep going out, suddenly you're at the whole world, right? So you have to come up with what a discrete way of thinking about the topic, which is always going to be somewhat imperfect, as in, you know, social science more qualitative in some ways. So that's the art of it. And in that case, we really looked at the field of philanthropy, foundations, folks who are working in philanthropy, grantees, people who are receiving philanthropy. So people really kind of enmeshed in that space of either participating by granting or receiving funds, and what was happening. And then a little bit of the general public discussion, but it's frankly kind of a specified field. People don't use the word philanthropy as much in the general public the way they do inside that realm. So we kind of focused in on that realm to really understand what's happening in that space of people who work within philanthropy or receivers of philanthropic funding. But that is a great question, because it's, again, with any complex system, if you're not careful about your point of view, you're going to end up like, I don't know where to listen, because it could be everything. So everything touches everything. And then I saw in here a question about social media monitoring. So some of the things we use in Meltwater is really great. And we used to have ways to search Twitter, but they've actually he privatized that, so it became very expensive. So Meltwater is a good one. We're designing these AI agents. So for folks who are, and we'll share more about that as we go. That's been a new one, just because it's more readily free and available to folks in the activist space. But if you're comfortable with AI, or if you've been experimenting with that, Claude is the one that we found is the most kind of, you know, neutral. And we'll share out some of these videos too. We have tutorials on how we're using the AI agents, but it's just it's, you know, it also imperfect, but has some really good qualities, and allows us to do something that doesn't cost a lot of money or require, you know, Meltwater does require you to pay and have an account. So depending on where you're at and what your organization is capable of. Someone said in here, Social Sprout. I haven't actually worked with that one, but we had a question regarding the listening phase. Is it possible to strategically begin sowing seeds of the hack? It is, yeah, definitely. I would just say do it at the end of the interview, not at the beginning, because you don't want to, you know, muddy the data. You want to really hear from people where they're at. So again, if you're listening to what is in the system, not what I wish to be, that's more the future's visioning, which will come with the hack. But yeah, if part of your interviewing process is building solidarity with others, then absolutely, you know, start seeding. These are some of ideas. These are some of the things we might be doing with this information, so that you can start to build allies in the space. That's a great idea, because it's kind of helping to build your network as you go. Yeah, the clue to look at my own Iowa map. Yes. It can be hard. We had that question before. Do I really have to talk to the people who are in the space that I'm trying to shift? And maybe it doesn't have to be a direct interview, but yeah, you want to be listening to the dominant narratives as well, which can be painful at times. So we're at time, but thank you, everybody. Really grateful for you showing up. I know for the whole Culture Hack Labs team, it means so much for us to share this information. Our goal is to build a movement of folks who are facile and legible in these tools. So we're very open source, really open to questions, feedback. If there's things you're trying that you want to share with us and we can share out with others, you know, let's build this together. So Sound World. Yes, last question.
I was just trying to situate how this will fall in my organization, like
Mhm.
not my organization as in organizing myself and the way I have
Mm.
to show up. Uh, so I see this as the biggest level right now, with the necessary guidance and caution that which is whose absence slows us down in our work, because we don't want to do things that create unnecessary ripple effects.
Mhm.
So my question is just this then. What is this is one level for you, Aubrey, and the level above it was to teach people. Uh, so yeah, how do we integrate, like, is there something in the whole process about integrating this level to the level that will come after this, a bigger whole than this?
You mean in terms of doing this work as a learning exercise and then doing it as an actual exercise? Is that what you're asking? Am I understanding the question correctly? And if folks need to leave, I understand we're at time, but I'm happy to stay on a little longer for questions. Is that what you mean by your question? Or sort of, I'm not sure I totally understand what you're asking.
I mean, in the scale of time and
Mhm.
this intervention, how does it integrate with what the next steps will be and what else is being done and
In your
how?
organization? You mean like other things that you're doing?
Let me just let me just give you one last thing then. So
Yeah.
there is some pattern that you trigger, and on one thing is that a lot of us have done yoga and we try to remove patterns, bad patterns from us, and
Yeah.
there are some patterns, but the cyclicity of things is the thing.
Yeah.
So how do you set up virtuous cycles, and what is going to be the best positive effect in the world out of it? How do you how do
Yeah.
you yeah,
Yeah, I think I
it's
understand what you're asking. It's a big question. I mean, this is sort of, and it's going to be context specific to the issue that you're working on. But yeah, we're complex adaptive living systems are complex, adaptive, and living, right? So we're jumping into something that is constantly shifting, changing, and moving. We're constantly shifting, changing, and moving, and we're trying to intervene in a way that disrupts the toxic patterns of the dominant culture that are creating suffering and harm, right? So there's a way in which there's a bit of courage involved. There's a bit of like trust and faith in your own ability to discern when and how to intervene. And there's a commitment to experimentation and innovation from a space of, trying to understand unintended consequences and also at every step do no harm, right? So there's a lot in that. And if your organization is really committed to this kind of work, it becomes something that becomes embedded in what you do. So you're never really done per se, because systems work tends to be long term, right? It's not something that's going to shift overnight. So you're really you're committing to a cyclical process that will come back around. And there may be like specific narrative hacks that you roll out that are related to a specific part of your work or a specific event that's happening. But the deeper narrative you're seeking to shift, you're going to be committed to coming back and reintegrating the learning, reabsorbing it into your understanding of what you're trying to do in this systems change, and then moving from that new space, right? So you're kind of like taking the small actions in service to, the way I think about it in futures thinking and in systems work is like, what is your guiding star? That's kind of your like, the world I wish to see if my work was complete and my job was done looks like this. And that's always pulling you forward while you take the small steps to move in that direction. But knowing that a lot of these big systems change efforts are, more than a lifetime, right? So how do you hold that long-term vision and still move in the present towards it in a way that feels possible within your capacity and within what you're doing in your organization and in your life? I hope that's helpful. We have one more question from, is it Ami?
Yeah, it's Amy.
Yeah, great.
I just wanted to go back to when you were talking about getting data and analytics from social media.
Mhm.
I've been working on building like a Python program that will like scrape the data directly from these websites. But I've had some questions about the ethics of it, because in this like small print terms and conditions, it does say that you're not supposed to like use, for example, Twitter
Mm,
to collect data. But if
mhm.
you're collecting only things that are already made public by the user, then I don't see why that wouldn't be okay. But do you have any thoughts on whether something like that is ethical, really?
Yeah, I mean,
Can-
I think if something's in the public domain and if you're using it towards a more thriving future and collective liberation and justice, that's an ethical decision that you make, you know, because just like as we know, not all laws are ethical, right? So not all privacy policies are ethical. So I think really a big piece of this living in this moment is what I call quantum ethics. It's like sort of a constant recalibration of like what is ethical in this moment for this particular situation. And so that's an internal inquiry that you'll have to make, balancing out those different things, you know, knowing that this is what I'm working towards, this is what's being, you know, put in front of me in terms of a privacy policy or a paywall or whatever it might be, and what is ethical in terms of my use of that or the way that I'm moving towards that. And is there any harm being done to the people that you know, are innocent in this situation, right? So that would be the questions I'd be asking myself. So the folks who are sharing their data, is it ethical to them? You know, is the work that I'm doing going to be, you know, in terms of creating more collective liberation and justice in the world? And then does that all add up and make sense? So it's a beautiful question to be asking. I'd love to learn more about the platform you're building, because we've been struggling with that since Twitter kind of closed down its openness. But yeah. So I'm going to close the call now, but I want to thank everybody for coming. Really, really beautiful to see you all here and this narrative community, and really grateful for your commitment to all that you do in the world and the spaces that you hold across this planet. Thank you. Be well. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.